This is the second to the last section on Professor Antony Sutton's book, The Federal Reserve Conspiracy. And in this last section of the book, he talks primarily about Abraham Lincoln. He talks about the money trust. He talks about the Jekyll Island conspiracy, and finally the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. So I'll be breaking this last part up into two sections. So to begin with, Dr. Sutton talks about Abraham Lincoln, and he says that Abraham Lincoln was in the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian tradition, and that is the tradition that reserved the right of issuing currency only for the federal government, and argued that this right could not be lawfully transferred to any private monopoly. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln presented to Congress a bill to make U.S. notes full legal tender, and he did this in order to fund the Civil War. So he wanted to enable the federal government to print enough money to finance the Civil War. The federal government then began issuing paper money that had the same value as gold and silver coins. The notes were printed in green ink, and they were known as greenbacks. Though Lincoln probably didn't envision the inflationary potential in this action, his financial program was to be a means of paying off debts without allowing the private money monopoly to profit from the public purse. Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury was a man by the name of Samuel Portland Chase, and Chase was an ally of the banking interest. During the Civil War, Chase supported Lincoln's monetary policy, but later on, he presented legislation to Congress that was favorable to the banking interest. Senator John Sherman of Ohio proposed the program of a national currency. This idea was opposed by banking interests because it would take away from the bankers the privilege of issuing an effective substitute for money, which of course is defined in the Constitution as gold and silver. What the bankers wanted the government to do was to transfer the right to issue money to them, i.e. to allow them to serve as agents of the federal government. The U.S. would then be a perpetual borrower, required to borrow funds at interest from a private money monopoly, which of course had obtained the monopoly power from the government itself. The public, apart from constitutional limits, would hardly agree to a private money monopoly if the truth were widely to be known. The National Bank Act was presented to the United States as a device to finance the Civil War and to achieve financial stability. The National Banking Act was in the Senate only 3 or 4 days and in the House only 2 days before it was rushed through, of course, at a critical time in the Civil War. And President Lincoln signed the bill into law on February 25, 1863. A letter from Senator John Sherman to Rothschild brothers in London, dated June 25, 1863, and leaked on Wall Street in 1863, demonstrates how Sherman saw a chance to curry favor with the preeminent world bankers of the time by bringing awareness of the National Banking Act to the attention of international bankers. The letter demonstrates the double dealing of even prominent and well-regarded politicians of the time. And here is what the letter said. Dear Sirs, a Mr. John Sherman has written to us from a town in Ohio, USA, as to the profit that may be made in the national banking business under a recent act of your Congress, and a copy of this act accompanies this letter. Apparently, this act has been drawn up on the plan formulated here by the British Bankers Association, and by that association recommended to our American friends, as one that, if enacted into law, would prove highly profitable to the banking industry throughout the world. Mr. Sherman declares that there has never been such an opportunity for capitalists to accumulate money as that presented by this act. It gives the National Bank almost complete control of the national finance. The few who understand the system, he says, will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class, while on the other hand, the great body of people, mentally incapable of comprehending the tremendous advantages that capital derives from the system, will bear its burden without complaint, and perhaps without even suspecting that the system is inimical to their interest, and it is signed, "Your respectful servants, Rothschild Brothers." The reply to this letter is dated July 6, 1863, and addressed to Messrs. Rothschild Brothers in London, England. As to the organization of the National Bank here, and the nature and profits of such investment, we beg leave to refer to our printed circulars enclosed herein. They are private corporations, organized for private gain, and select their own officers and employees. They are not subject to control of state laws, except as Congress may from time to time provide. The currency is printed by the U.S. government in a form so like greenbacks that the people do not detect the difference, although the currency is but a promise of the bank to pay. The demand for money is so great that this money can be readily loaned to the people across the counter of the bank at a discount at the rate of 10% at 30 to 60 days' time, making it about 12% interest on the currency. The interest on the bonds plus the interest on the currency which the bonds secure, plus incidentals of the business, ought to make the gross earnings of the bank amount to from 28% to 33.5%. National banks are privileged to increase and contract their currency at will, and of course can grant or withhold loans as they see fit. It follows that they can be, by united action in refusing to make loans, cause a stringency in the money market, and in a single week or even in a single day, cause a decline in all products of the country. And it's signed requesting that you will regard this as strictly confidential. Most respectfully yours, Eichelheimer, Morton, and Vandergould. So, of course, they are talking about creating artificial booms and busts in the economy. Samuel P. Chase was President Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, and he stated publicly that my agency in promoting the passage of the National Banking Act was the greatest financial mistake of my life. It has built up a monopoly which affects every interest in the country. It should be repealed. But before that can be accomplished, the people will be arrayed on one side and the banks on the other, in a contest such as we have never seen before in this country. And of course, that notion that the people are going to rise up against this has, of course, never happened, mainly because the people are completely in the dark about the whole system, how it operates, and how it in fact came into being. So if you recall from earlier videos, there has been a fight over having a central bank in the United States since the nation's inception. At first it was Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton that were locked in a dispute about creating a national bank. When that bank was created and its charter ran out, a second bank was created, of course, under the auspices that the United States needed money to fight the War of 1812. Incidentally, the idea of needing money to fight a war is very oftentimes used in these instances. So it was also used with the War of 1812 because President Madison did not want to sign the charter for the second bank, but because of the War of 1812, he did so anyway. Of course, then we have the fight between Andrew Jackson over another creation of another central bank in the United States. And that bank's charter eventually ran out. So that left the United States in the 1860s in an era that was called the free banking era where there was no central bank. However, the money trust never gave up its fight to create a central bank in the United States. So now Dr. Sutton tells the story of how the conspiracy really was hatched to create the Federal Reserve System. And first, I'd like to give a quote from President Woodrow Wilson, who was elected president in 1912. This is what Woodrow Wilson was saying before he was elected president, when he was trying to pretend he was against the money trust. He said, "The greatest monopoly in this country is the money monopoly. So long as that exists, our old variety of freedom and individual energy of development are out of the question. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. This is the greatest question of all, and to this statesmen must address themselves with earnest determination to serve the long future and the true liberties of free men. Unfortunately, President Woodrow Wilson was heavily influenced by the money trust behind the scenes and by a very odd man by the name of Colonel Mandel House, which the history textbooks never talk about either. All right, so Paul Warburg and the drive for an American central bank. So in 1907, an economic financial panic was used by the bankers and their allies to urge the necessity to have another central bank. And a German banker named Paul Warburg led a zealous drive to promote a carbon copy of the German central bank, the German Reichsbank, in the United States. In 1913, the money trust and the 1907 panic were investigated by Congress, and it recorded the enormous power of the J.P. Morgan firm. During the years 1900 and 1920, the money trust was effectively controlled by the banking firm of J.P. Morgan, and then his son, J.P. Morgan Jr., in association with their Rockefeller, Harriman, and Keenlobe allies. In 1912, Congress investigated the money trust, and the committee was called the Pujo Committee. And the report that came out of the Pujo Committee, this is from the 62nd Congress, the third session, was that the money trust was far more dangerous than all that has happened to us in the past in the way of elimination of competition in industry, is the control of credit through the domination of these groups over banks and industries. It is impossible that there should be competition with all of the facilities for raising money or selling large issues of bonds in the hands of those few bankers and their partners and allies, who together dominate the financial policies of most of the existing systems. The acts of this inner group, as here described, have nevertheless been more destructive of competition than anything accomplished by the trust, for they strike at the very vitals of potential competition in every industry that is under their protection, a condition which, if permitted to continue, will render impossible all attempts to restore normal competitive conditions in the industrial world. The public in America debated over the wisdom of creating a central bank in the United States, just as it had done during previous eras of U.S. history that I've already mentioned. The 1907 crash was repeatedly used as the argument by those in favor of creating a central bank. The argument put forth was that a central bank system would be a way to stop financial panics from occurring. However, many years later, it was proven that this panic was precipitated by Wall Street, so by the very people, the money trust, who were saying we need to have a central bank to stop these panics. They, in fact, precipitated it. So the same group that stood to benefit from a central bank created the panic used to persuade the electorate that a central bank was needed. And in 1976, a congressional staff report had this as its conclusion. This is from the 94th Congress second session in 1976. In summary, the Federal Reserve directors are apparently representative of a small elite group which dominates much of the economic life of this nation. Given that so many Americans were opposed to the idea of a central bank under private control, how then did it come to be established? Supreme Court Justice Brandeis described the process this way: the development of our financial oligarchy, with which the history of political despotism has familiarized us, usurpation proceeding by gradual encroachment rather than by violent acts, and by subtle and often long concealed concentration. It was by such processes as these that Caesar Augustus became master of Rome. The makers of our Constitution had in mind like dangers to our political liberty when they provided so carefully for the separation of powers. The J.P. Morgan firm, which dominated the money trust, understood this process of subtle and gradual encroachment. They even publicly opposed the Federal Reserve Bill, which privately they put together in secret. The Morgan complex in 1912 was able to dominate Wall Street banks and so the money trust. This system worked well in the late 19th century and early 20th century. The history of the system of how the Federal Reserve came into being can be traced through three stages, says Dr. Professor Antony Sutton. He says the original plan created secretly on Jekyll Island in 1910, the promotion of Woodrow Wilson for President of the United States, and finally, the actual passage of the Federal Reserve Bill through the Congress. So I will wrap up in the next video and talk about those three stages.